Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's First Lady Friday. This week, we're going to be talking about an iconic First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. So, Eleanor Roosevelt has a lot of wonderful quotes that we still attribute to her today. One of my favorites is actually in her autobiography, and that is, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." So I didn't actually know that this was pulled directly from her autobiography, so I'm really excited to read a sneak peek of what she has in store in this book. Today we're just going to be reading the preface, but I'm really excited to share with you this little bit of her story, and even just an introduction to what is in the pages of this book, and I hope that you'll join me in reading the full thing. So I just wanted to share a couple of quick things before we jump right into the reading, just to give you a little context for what Eleanor Roosevelt is writing about in this preface specifically. So she was married to FDR, and as I'm sure you know, his first year as president was in 1933. So while her time as First Lady was in the 30s, she did not actually write this autobiography until 1960. So that's when she's writing about as the modern day. A lot of what she's talking about in the preface for her book is just how times change. And so she's talking a little bit about her grandmother's time when social class looked a lot different. Where it was the wealthy just stayed wealthy and had these estates and all of the stability that went along with that to much closer to the modern day. So I want to challenge you to just think about if you can connect with any of these ideas of our world today, just being so changing and fast-paced. I know that I definitely had a lot of these ideas resonate with me, but I would love to hear from you. So feel free to give us a call and share what you're thinking about, or call a fellow Marconi member just to talk about that idea. What does it mean to live in a changing world? So I hope you enjoy the reading. Excellent. So as I said, today we're reading Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography, written by Eleanor Roosevelt. Preface. This is both an abbreviated and an augmented edition of my autobiography. Abbreviated because, as far as possible, material of only passing interest has been eliminated. Augmented by the addition of new material that brings the book up to date. When I first embarked on the story of my life, the chief problem I faced was to decide what to put in. Now, in preparing this shorter version, I have had to decide what to leave out. In both cases, the major difficulty lay in trying to see myself and my activities and what happened to me within the framework of a larger picture. It is not easy to attain this kind of perspective because, for me, as almost everyone, I think, the things that mattered most have not been the big important things, but the small personal things. No one, it seems to me, can really see his own life clearly any more than he can see himself, as his friends or enemies can from all sides. It is a moral as well as a physical impossibility. The most one can achieve is to try to be as honest as possible. What my purpose has been, I indicated at the end of This Is My Story. It occurs to me to wonder why anyone should have the courage, or as many people probably think, the vanity to write an autobiography. In analyzing my own reasons, I think I have two objectives. One was to give a picture, if possible, of the world in which I grew up and in which today is changing in many ways. The other is to give as truthful a picture as possible of a human being. A real picture of any human being is interesting in itself, and it is especially interesting when we can follow the play of other personalities upon that human being, and perhaps get a picture of a group of people and of the influence on them of the period in which they lived. The great difference between the world of the 1880s and today's seems to me to be an extraordinary speeding up of our physical surroundings. I was, for many years, a sounding board for the teachings and influence of my immediate surroundings. The ability to think for myself did not develop until I was well on in life, and therefore no real personality developed in my early youth. This will not be so of young people today. They must become individuals responsible for themselves at a much earlier age because of the conditions in which they find themselves in their everyday lives. The world of my grandmother was a world of well-ordered custom and habit, more or less slow to change. The world of today accepts something new overnight, and in 2 years it has become the old and established custom, and we have almost forgotten it was ever new. The reason that fiction is more interesting than any other form of literature to those of us who like to study people is that in fiction, the author can really tell the truth without hurting anyone and without humiliating himself too much. He can reveal what he has learned through observation and experience of the inner workings of the souls of men. In an autobiography, this is hard to do. Try as you will. The more honest you are about yourself and others, however, the more valuable what you have written will be in the future as a picture of the people and their problems during the period covered by the autobiography. Every individual, as he goes through life, has different problems and reacts differently to the same circumstances. Different individuals see and feel the same things in different ways. Something in them colors the world and their lives. Their experiences and their lessons will be different in each individual case. To me, who dreamed so much as a child, who made a dream world in which I was the heroine of an unending story, the lives of people around me have continued to have a certain storybook quality. I learned something which has stood me in good stead many times. The most important thing in any relationship is not what you get, but what you give. My Hall family were typical, I think, of the 1900s. Somewhere in the background, there were people who had worked with their hands and with their heads and worked hard, but the need was no longer there, and at that time the material conditions of life seemed stable. My grandfather Hall typified this group in his generation that had reached a goal. He was a gentleman of leisure and enjoyed using his brains. He liked to have the stimulation of intelligent companionship, but did not feel the need to work. In his children, many of the qualities of the hard-fisted, hard-headed ancestors had faded away, but their world was not so stable as they thought, and their money began to slip through their fingers. Today, 2 generations later, the world has changed so much that many of the younger members of the family have to begin again at scratch, and it is interesting to see that, with necessity, many of them develop the same abilities that existed in the working forebears. This cycle, which I have watched in my family, is one reason why, in our country, it always amuses me when any one group of people take it for granted that, because they have been privileged for a generation or two, they've been set apart in any way from the man or woman who is working in order to keep the wolf from the door. It is only luck and a little temporary veneer, and before long the wheels may turn, and one and all must fall back on whatever basic quality they have. This idea would never have occurred to my grandmother. For to her, the world seemed more or less permanently fixed. But to us today, it is a mere platitude, and our children and grandchildren accept it without turning a hair. On the other side of my family, of course, many people whom I have mentioned will be described far better and more fully by other people, except in the case of my father, whose short and happy early life was so tragically ended. With him, I have a curious feeling that as long as he remains to me as the vivid living person that he is, he will, after the manner of the people in The Blue Bird, be alive and continue to exert his influence, which has always been a gentle, kindly one. The more the world speeds up, the more it seems necessary that we should learn to pick out of the past the things that we feel were important and beautiful then. One of these things was a quality of tranquility in people, which you rarely meet today. Perhaps one must have certain periods of life lived in more or less tranquil surroundings in order to attain that particular quality. I read not long ago in David Grayson's The Countryman's Year these words: "Back of tranquility lies always conquered unhappiness." That may be so, but perhaps these grandparents of ours found it a little easier to conquer unhappiness because their lives were not lived at high tension so constantly. Certainly, all of us must conquer some unhappiness in our lives. Autobiographies are, after all, useful only as the lives you read about and analyze may suggest to you something that you may find useful in your own journey through life. I do not expect, of course, that anyone will find exactly the same experiences or the same mistakes or the same gratifications that I have found, but perhaps my very foolishness may be helpful. The mistakes I made when my children were so young may give some help or some consolation to some troubled and groping mother. Because of one's timidity, one sometimes is more severe with the children or more irritated at trifles, and one feels the necessity to prove one's power over the only defenseless thing in sight. We, all of us, owe, I imagine, far more than we realize to our friends as well as to the members of our family. I know that in my own case, my friends are responsible for much that I have become, and without them there are many things which would have remained closed books to me. From the time of my marriage, the life I lived seems more closely allied with the life that all of us know today. It was colorful, active, and interesting. The lessons learned were those of adaptability and adjustment and finally of self-reliance and developing into an individual as every human being must. I have sketched briefly the short trip to Europe after World War I, and yet I think that trip has had far-reaching consequences for me. I had known Europe, and particularly France with its neat and patterned countryside, fairly well. The picture of desolation fostered in me an undying hate of war, which was not definitely formulated before that time. The conviction of the uselessness of war as a means of finding any final solution to international difficulties grew stronger and stronger as I listened to people talk. I said little about it at the time, but the impression was so strong that instead of fading out of my memory, it has become more deeply etched upon it year by year. In This Is My Story, I cover my early years, the vanishing world in which I grew up, the influences and the values that dominated that era. In This I Remember, I dealt with a broader and more vital period, concerned for the most part with my husband's political life during one of the most dramatic and eventful times in history, and with the gradual broadening of my own activities. In On My Own, I tried to give some picture of the changing world as I have seen it during recent years, and of the various jobs into which I plunged in the hope that, by building international understanding and cooperation, we could hold at bay the ugly stupidity of war and learn to substitute for it, however slowly or painfully, or reluctantly, an era of brotherhood. In the final part of this book, The Search for Understanding, I have added new material covering the past few years. They have been busy years, with every half hour of every day filled with my working day, often extending from 8 in the morning until well past midnight. These crowded hours have been interesting and stimulating. They have, I hope, been useful. They have, at least, been lived to the hilt. In the long run, an autobiography is valuable only if it accomplishes one of two things, or preferably both. It may help to preserve, through the eyes of an individual, a record of a way of life that has vanished, or of people who were historically important in their own era, and so add, even minutely, to our understanding of the background. Or in a more personal way, it may help other people to solve their problems. There is nothing particularly interesting about one's life story unless people can say, as they read it, "Why, this is like what I've been through. Perhaps, after all, there is a way to work it out." Let me hasten to say that I do not suggest that my solution should, or could, prove a guide to anyone. About the only value the story of my life may have is to show that one can, even without any particular gifts, overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable if one is willing to face the fact that they must be overcome. That, in spite of timidity and fear, in spite of a lack of special talents, one can find a way to live widely and fully. Perhaps the most important thing that has come out of my life is the discovery that if you prepare at every point as well as you can, with whatever means you may have, however meager they may seem, you'll be able to grasp opportunity for broader experience when it appears. Without preparation, you cannot do it. The fatal thing is the rejection. Life was meant to be lived, and curiosity must be kept alive. One must never, for whatever reason, turn his back on life. Eleanor Roosevelt, Hyde Park, December 1960. Thanks again for reading along with me today. I hope that you'll let us know that you watched, and call a friend or call us and let us know what you thought about this little excerpt from Eleanor Roosevelt's autobiography. Thanks. Have a great weekend.